Good afternoon, everybody. It's 1 o'clock. Let me give it a couple more minutes. I do not have the membership in front of me, but from the looks of things, we're missing a couple of folks. So let's wait just a couple of minutes and then we'll get started. I know your time is important, and we'll get started very soon. I see we've picked up a few more folks, so it's 1:02. Let's not delay any further. No one is stuck in traffic or looking for a place to park. Virtual meeting. 2020 has been that kind of year, so welcome back. This is the Body Worn Camera Work Group. So, and I'm Secretary Brian Moran, and welcome back to this group and this meeting, and very much appreciate everyone's attention this afternoon. A lot has transpired. To say a lot of water over the dam or under the bridge since we last met, it would be an understatement. A lot has gone on. We've had a historic special session. Many of you, I look at the names and faces of this particular group, and you are very involved in this last special session and will be as these laws become effective. So very much appreciate all that involvement and engagement. A lot of work indeed. But we're back. Not sure if I'd call this, we're back to more mundane issues or not compared to the special session, but I would refer to the body worn camera issues as a significant one and very related to the special session and the new police reforms, the criminal justice reform. So as you recall, this work group was established in 2019 Appropriations Act to continue the work of the 2018 work group led by the Virginia Compensation Board. The continued and increased use of body-worn cameras by law enforcement play a significant role and will continue to play a significant role as we implement and build on the historic criminal justice reforms and police reforms enacted during this special session. Body-worn cameras have long been recognized as a valuable tool for law enforcement to help improve transparency and accountability of law enforcement agencies in their interactions with the public. This group was initially tasked with looking at the costs of acquiring and maintaining body-worn cameras and the fiscal impact on Commonwealth's attorneys associated with reviewing body camera footage, and we appreciate Mr. Stawley and Ms. Taylor's bringing this attention and pursuing this issue, and that's what we're trying to assess is the cost. But then as we did assess and began to assess the cost for Commonwealth's attorneys, clearly we determined body cameras also impact other stakeholders in the criminal justice system, like public defenders and other defense attorneys, court-appointed attorneys who get paid very little, and the time involved in these would make it even less lucrative to be on that court-appointed list. Circuit and district court clerks also, we heard from them with respect to the time that is required, and of course local government. So at today's meeting we will hopefully you'll all have the agenda in front of you. We'll have the wonderful David Cotter, who has been wonderful to work with. He's been giving us a tremendous amount of assistance during this special session. He's over at DCJS. He's the Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs, and he's going to be giving us a review. And then we will hear from Robin DeSocio with the Compensation Board with respect to the data that's required to be submitted by Commonwealth's attorneys, including the number of hours of body-worn camera footage received, broken down into felonies, misdemeanors, and traffic offenses, along with the number of hours spent redacting the body-worn camera footage. Importantly, the budget amendments adopted during the 2020 special session appropriated $6.4 million for body-worn camera law enforcement grants. Eric Smith, also from the Department of Criminal Justice Services, he serves as the Director of Law Enforcement Policy and Standards, will be giving an overview of this grant funding. Finally, I want to take an opportunity to introduce Harvey Powers. I want to make sure he's up here. Let's see. Well, Harvey Powers is new areas. He's also, there you go, Harvey. Nice to see you, sir. He's the new Director of Law Enforcement Division of DCJS. And so it's great to see him aboard. He has many of you already might know him. Harvey served 25 years with the Richmond Police Department, rising through the ranks until retiring in 2018 as a captain. So he's bringing a wealth of knowledge and experience to DCJS and law enforcement training. For the past 5 years, Harvey has been an instructor for fair and impartial policing that teaches implicit bias courses to law enforcement countries. So that was a very important aspect of his recruitment and his selection, because that was a great deal of work and discussion around those issues with respect to the special session and going forward in terms of training and making sure Virginia is a leader in these issues. So great agenda ahead. Very much appreciate everybody joining us. And with that, I am going to turn it over to David Cotter.
Good afternoon, everybody. My spot on the agenda is really just to give you a brief overview of what the activities of this work group was in 2019. And I want to thank everybody here just for their efforts and work they put into the 2019 activities for the work group and the continued work that's going to go forward. So just as a review, the charge of the work group that was set forth in the Appropriations Act is to examine the workload impact as well as other fiscal and policy impacts on the Commonwealth's public safety and judicial agencies as a whole, which is a fairly broad mandate. So the work group last year in 2019 held 3 meetings on July 29th, September 4th, and October 8th. And so at the first meeting in July, what the work group primarily did was get a review of the Virginia Compensation Board's 2018 report that started the whole ball rolling, looking at body-worn cameras and the workload impact, as the Secretary mentioned, pretty much brought to the fore by Colin Stolley and Shannon Taylor for us to look at. And it focused primarily, the report focused primarily on the impact of body-worn cameras on the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office. In addition, at that meeting, we also heard from Money Committee staff and Commonwealth's attorneys again about that workload. And in the discussions at that first meeting is what really made us understand that the breadth of the issue is not limited to the Commonwealth's attorneys. It revealed that lots of other stakeholders have experienced significant impacts by the use of body-worn cameras, and that these impacts needed to be more thoroughly explored. And so the second and third meetings of the work group last in 2019 were primarily focused on getting more information from these other stakeholders. At the September meeting, the work group heard presentations on the workload and cost impacts on public defenders and defense attorneys, as well as on law enforcement agencies. In addition, heard presentations on the cost to localities for establishing body-worn camera programs, things like liability coverage and all that. as well as the impact on the circuit courts when dealing with body-worn camera footage as evidence. And then at the October meeting, we also heard presentations about the retention and disclosure of body-worn camera footage and the requirements under the Freedom of Information Act and the Public Records Act, because those bodies of law apply to all this footage, and compliance with those bodies of law causes, issues and additional workload and additional workload in handling this stuff. And so getting a primer on that was essential. In addition, the work group received an update from the compensation board on the workload data that it had received so far, the first quarter of workload data from the Commonwealth's attorneys, which is required to be reported under the budget. The October meeting was the third and final meeting for 2019 for this work group. And at that meeting, the work group did adopt several recommendations by consensus, primarily focusing on the need to continue the study of body-worn cameras and the need to collect data from Commonwealth attorneys, of course, but as well as all the other stakeholders who are impacted by the use of body-worn cameras in the criminal justice system, in order to determine the fiscal and policy impacts on these stakeholders as the work group goes forward and crafts further recommendations. And that is the sum and substance of what the work group's last 3 meetings were in 2019, which brings us to today's meeting.
Thank you, David. Is that it? Your report?
That is it for the report of
the review.
All right, the review.
Thank you, sir. Let's jump to, any questions of Mr. Cotter? Hearing none. Let's go to Robin DeSocio, who's the Executive Director of the Virginia Compensation Board. Robin?
Okay. Sorry, I was realizing that I couldn't share my screen while I was, I guess, not the presenter. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Just want to make sure. Can you all see the presentation screen?
Robin, we can see it.
Robin.
Compensation board. Yep. Body-worn camera activities update 2020.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to be sure you all could see the presentation screen. So, and you all asked me to provide sort of an update of activities with to the body-worn cameras. So I wanted to start just a little bit with a point of background. As we talked about before, there are 120 Commonwealth Attorney's offices in Virginia, and 87 of those, which was about 72%, of those offices were working with their local law enforcement agencies that implemented or had previously implemented the use of body-worn cameras in fiscal year 20. So among those localities, there were approximately 8,782 body-worn cameras that were deployed across Virginia's law enforcement agencies last year. Now, about 6,110 of those, or 70%, were primarily were primarily deployed in localities in Central Virginia, Northern Virginia, and Hampton Roads. And then 3729, or about 42% of them, are in relatively smaller localities, populations of less than 100,000, or and then what we would call the larger localities, more than 100,000 population. About 58% of the cameras were deployed across those larger localities. Now, we did talk briefly at the last meeting, at the end of last year's study, about some preliminary data collection in the fall of 2019, where about 42% of the offices that were dealing with that had body-worn cameras provided a little bit of data for us. So in December of 2019, Commonwealth Attorney Colin Stelly of Virginia Beach and I met at the Commonwealth Attorney Services Council Executive Training Program to present information to a large collective group of the Commonwealth attorneys about the body-worn camera studies just kind of providing an overview of what the initial study had shown and the need for the ongoing collection of the data, and to talk about the types of data that we would need to collect from them going forward. And so over the course of fiscal year 20, we did have a little bit of an improvement in the collection of data. So there were 48 offices. This is out of the 87. So about 55% of those that had body-worn cameras implemented in their localities provided data to us in fiscal year 2020. Now, those offices reporting the data are from localities with about 70% of the body-worn cameras that are deployed across Virginia among law enforcement agencies in fiscal year 20. And then also, when we kind of broke out the statistics or the reporting among the different sizes of localities and the populations that were served that had body-worn cameras, about 68% of the offices where body-worn cameras are deployed reported their data for fiscal year 20 or reported some data for fiscal year 20. So all offices did not report all quarters of data, but 75% of the offices reported data for at least 2 quarters, if not 3 or 4 quarters for the year. And then finally, I would just say that while the data reporting did improve overall throughout fiscal year 20, we've still been talking with Colin Solly, and he and I have talked about plans to continue to kind of take measures to improve the consistency of the data and try to get more of those, especially smaller offices, to report more of their data to us. So again, while not all of the offices did provide a breakdown of their hours by numbers and types of cases, we did pull together the average numbers of hours of body-worn camera footage that was reported each quarter. So we pulled together all of the offices and the numbers of quarters that they reported so that we could come up with an average for each office, just to have, consistency for looking at everything. And overall, and again, this was out of 46 offices, we had a total for each quarter of just over 35,000 hours of footage that was sent to the Commonwealth's attorney's offices by their local law enforcement agencies. So that works out to about 11,853 hours of body-worn camera footage received per month. And again, that's just out of 46 offices, which is, more than half of the 87 that had cameras. But again, they're more swayed towards the larger offices. So think about it more in terms of those maybe 68% of offices that have reported. And then also, as far as the data goes, we also had an average of 1,069 hours spent on redacting videos, or approximately 356 hours per month redacting. So we're not really seeing a lot of redaction going on of the videos. I would say that that the redaction numbers represent only about 3% of the total video time that the Commonwealth's attorneys are receiving. We also have some statistics that I didn't include here about the time that they take to share the videos with other entities, most likely defense attorneys. And there wasn't a lot of time reported as being devoted to that either. I know in a lot of cases, and our Commonwealth's attorney folks who are here can speak to that, but I believe in a lot of cases, they're able to provide access to that video data instead of having to take the time to cut it out and send it themselves. And they can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But just generally, we didn't get a lot of data reported on that time taken to share that data. So I want to talk a little bit more. I also wanted to mention, just kind of keeping in mind the impact that the pandemic has had on law enforcement activities and court processes. We did see that the data that was reported in the fourth quarter did show a little bit lower numbers on the body-worn camera footage. So partly perhaps because not as many localities reported that quarter, but also even amongst those localities that did report or those Commonwealth Attorney's Office that did report, we did see those numbers come down a little bit on the body worn camera, which is why we gave you kind of the average over the year as opposed to the details for the quarter. So there is more analysis still, that we're going to do on the data. I think it would be helpful to have a little bit more of the offices reporting, especially in the smaller jurisdictions. When we looked at the percentages of data, I would say, like I said, the larger localities were reporting on average about 68%, but when we looked at the smaller offices, it was closer to maybe 30 to 40% of those smaller offices that were reporting their data. So to be able to look at kind of analyses for different size offices, we want to try to encourage those smaller offices to get more data in. So I wanted to talk a little bit as well about funding support for these offices. You'll recall also that for fiscal year 20, localities did provide additional resources to support this workload in a number of offices. So of the 87 Commonwealth Attorney's offices and localities with body-worn cameras, about 72%, 63 offices received funding in fiscal year 20 for full-time and part-time staff or other non-personal services funding to support the workload from body-worn cameras. But there were about 20% of offices that had agreed to receive no funding from their locality to support body-worn cameras. Excuse me. Localities did in fiscal year 20 provide about $7.5 million to support the impact of body-worn cameras and the workload in Commonwealth Attorney's offices through the funding of staff and other salary support. And while many localities did not provide funding based upon the Appropriation Act language that provides for 1 assistant attorney per 75 body-worn cameras, the majority of them did come to alternative agreements with their localities regarding support funding. I will mention there were also a handful, maybe 10 offices that had body-worn cameras in fiscal year 20 that agreed to no additional funding support from their localities. Now, we don't have complete information yet about changes in deployment of numbers of body-worn cameras for fiscal year 21 or changes or additions to the resources provided by the localities. We do have some of that data, but we plan to continue to collect that and have more of it available for a subsequent meeting. I also wanted to mention we do also have some preliminary data for fiscal year 21. For today, I just wanted to provide you the update of the years of data that we had. But we do have some data already for what would be the third quarter of calendar year 20 or first quarter of fiscal year 21. So again, we'll continue working on getting more data for fiscal year 21. Lastly, I wanted to mention funding support from the Commonwealth. We did in fiscal year 20, well, let me back up a little bit. As we talked about in the preliminary work group, and we talked about a little bit last year as we went through the recommendations from the first work group, you know, from a Commonwealth perspective and related to Commonwealth attorneys' workload impacts, our focus has been on providing sufficient staffing support for Commonwealth attorneys' offices to manage their statutorily prescribed responsibilities and their daily workload. So what happens now is that, you know, local governments provide a lot of support to make up for the staffing that our standards show that they're due. So their ability to provide staffing and other resource support for the workload impacts of body-worn cameras is hampered when they're already providing those resources for basic office functioning to make up for the staffing support that we've not been funded to provide. So the process to address these needs with Commonwealth funding began in fiscal year 20. I mean, certainly we've had staffing standards in place for years, and prior to a few years ago, we hadn't had additional resources to allocate since fiscal year 08. But so starting, well, a couple years ago at this point, we did get additional resources through the governor's introduced budget and through the legislative session to fund in fiscal year 20 the allocation of 32 assistant Commonwealth attorneys, 32 additional assistant Commonwealth attorneys and support staff positions, representing about 20% of the unfunded positions that were due across Virginia. And then last December in 2019, the governor's introduced budget bill did include funding and language to support the allocation of another 29 assistant Commonwealth attorneys and support staff positions to meet what was then 25% of the still unfunded needs defined by our existing staffing standards. So while these positions and funding were approved by the 2020 General Assembly, they were, of course, one of numerous funding initiatives that had been approved, but were then unallotted during the reconvened session in April. So although some funding that had been unallotted was restored during the 2020 special session for other criminal justice and judicial entities, these funds for staffing and Commonwealth attorneys' offices were not restored during the special session. So consequently, there are still over 140 positions that are due statewide in Commonwealth attorneys' offices at an annual cost of about $5.8 million just to address felony prosecution in circuit court, really without consideration of recent changes, such as the changes to the rules of discovery, the added workload resulting from the implementation of body-worn cameras, and other potential workload impacts of recent criminal justice reform initiatives, or even just routine prosecution in lower courts that are deemed essential. So, from a funding standpoint, we still think it's appropriate to focus on what the Commonwealth, what the compensation boards should be providing to support these offices just for their basic functioning, so that we can help support localities that are having to pitch in to cover those basics, and then be able to provide support for body-worn cameras. So that's where I am with my update. As I mentioned, we do intend to have information for subsequent meetings to provide further analysis on the data that's been gathered so far, as well as to pull in the data for fiscal year 21. Again, we're also looking for to provide more information about any growth in the deployment of body-worn cameras and locality resources provided in the current year. I know we've heard anecdotally that some localities have not been able to provide the same resources that they were providing previously because of trying to address issues with the pandemic. So I expect we'll see some kind of up and down over the course of this year as we deal with the data for fiscal year 21. But that's what I have for you all today, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions that you might have about the information that I've reported.
Great, thanks, Robin. There is a hand function, I believe, with this raise hand, but go ahead. If anyone has any questions, has a question, please speak up. Colin, Mr. Strawley, or Shannon Taylor, you're both on. Thank you. 356 hours per month. That's 160. I mean, I think you're supposed to do what? 160 a month, 40-hour weeks. I know we don't work 40-hour weeks. But I'd be curious. I mean, is that what you're experiencing? That's more than 2 people for the month reviewing the footage. You want to comment on that?
Go ahead, Colin.
Well, I will say, right. I think that is reflective of what we're experiencing. And in Virginia Beach, we don't even have all of our body cameras on the street yet. We still have another quarter of 25% of our body cameras that are yet to be deployed. I do want to back up and just say on the reporting numbers that Robin shared with all of us, I would say that the offices reporting their numbers were a victim of COVID as well. It just did not seem to happen over the few months where offices were working under different circumstances than normal. But we anticipate the reporting to go back up over the next year. And in addition to that, BACA has hired an administrator, which is also going to be working closely on making sure that the numbers get reported properly to the comp board so that we can all take a look at what these numbers really are.
And I'll just add that when we're talking about the collection of the data, and Robin did talk about this, the time that it takes to obtain that body-worn camera footage. So right now, the agreement between a prosecutor's office and your lead law enforcement agency are not all the same in terms of having that direct access. So, for example, we are actually changing our policy. We have a new chief here in Henrico County. Chief Eric English, who is reviewing the body-worn camera policy, and which I believe is going to be more expansive, which I support, and is going to give us direct access. So we used to waste my support staff's time in terms of, downloading, uploading, downloading before we could even send that information to the Defense Council. So while I know we're being very, very mindful about the attorneys, their time commitment, there are support staff issues as well that we are not focusing on this time, but I do think warrant a statement for that in support of them. And then lastly, to Colin's point, the idea about what is the policy that each individual office is operating under. I have implemented that, because of some circumstances that had arisen this past summer, that my attorneys were mandated to watch every hour. And I know, and we talked about this during the work group, but I think it bears repeating again, because that may be humanly impossible. To the secretary's point of that, there's only so many hours in a day. And I often think that my office is underreporting probably some of the information, but I think, we're doing the best job we can. And to Colin's point about how important this data is, I do want to recognize that he is going to be our president for VACA. So I know this is going to be very important for the agenda moving forward for next year. And we are all relying on this data. So to the point that we can make it be as accurate as possible, it's just going to help all of us as we move forward. So thank you, Secretary, for allowing me to speak.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Colin. Congratulations, Colin, on your appointment. I think. I
think. I'm not sure.
Well, it should be a little less. I can't even say. I don't think it'll be as busy as the special session going forward, but no guarantees. Hey, Dave Johnson, how about hearing from the defense attorneys and any other defense attorneys that are on the call? Dave Johnson?
Sure. We, nothing really new to report. We were impacted by the pandemic in our ability to collect any more data. I would just say body-worn camera continues to put a strain on our offices, just like it does the CA offices. We are not in a position to get any help from the localities with that respect so far. So we look to the state for that. We are hopefully going to get a few new positions, which would represent the first additional attorney positions we've gotten in over a decade. They were not actually, that's something we've been working on for years. It was not really in response to body-worn camera, but general workload, but they'll certainly be welcome. But not the bigger concern, but the concern that is just, I think, even harder to address is the private bar doing court-appointed work. And there may be somebody on the line who wants to talk about that. But, my concern was when I gave my presentation, first of all, the group of attorneys in the private bar who reported this being a huge problem. And I was more concerned with the ones who reported it being no problem at all, because the implication is they're just not watching the body-worn camera and justifying that by the fact they're not getting paid to do it. So that's going to be, I think, it may be a harder thing to get a handle on, because the answer is the pay structure and the hard caps with limited waiver, and I'm not sure, the answer to that is paying them more so they can watch the body-worn camera. No easy answers.
Well, you have invited comment from others on the panel. I think that's appropriate. I think you really put a finger on that, no question. Any other court-appointed or defense attorneys on the panel that want to weigh in? Hearing none. Robin, I want to thank you. Despite COVID, I thought you had some pretty robust numbers. So I want to recognize the Commonwealth Attorney's submission of that data. I think we can glean, some conclusions from that. It's sufficient to at least analyze, and so I appreciate that work. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't want to make it sound like we don't, like they aren't reporting. I think that the numbers, when you look at where the cameras are in the offices that are reporting, you know, they're getting some data in. It's a good representation of most of the offices. You know, there are some small offices that report that say, I didn't have anything this quarter, or I had 1 hour this quarter. And so, you know, I think for them, they don't have as much to add. And I don't know that means that's all they got, or, you know, I don't know what that means, but definitely some of the smaller offices report some pretty small numbers. So I think the fact that we are getting a good percentage of the larger offices, you know, definitely is helpful. And then within that data, there is some inconsistency as far as, you know, are they reporting the types of cases or the numbers of types of cases to go with the hours? So that's what we really need to clean up to get better analysis. But I think that they are, you know, doing a good job of getting in, and Colin and I can work together some more to just make sure that we're making sure they understand what we need.
Great. All right. Well, hearing no further questions of Robin, we'll move on to the next item, and that's Eric Smith, who is the Manager of Law Enforcement Policy and Standards for the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services. So, Eric, I hand it over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And if you give me just a moment so I can pop my screen share up. All right. So as noted earlier, I'm going to talk about the 2020 Special Session Appropriations Act regarding body-worn camera grants, and also just a little bit about what's gone on in recent past, and then some stuff DCJS has done historically regarding body-worn cameras, just as a little bit of background information. So to start, in the 2020 regular session for the General Assembly, the General Assembly passed legislation which became 15.2.1723.1, which put some requirements on localities regarding body-worn cameras. Prior to this, it was a free-for-all, whether you were, or how you employed your body-worn cameras, how you deployed them. This changed it to where now body-worn cameras actually have an explicit codified definition, which everybody can read. And there's a requirement that any agency prior to deploying a body-worn camera system must have a written policy in place using the DCJS model policy as guidance. And then that policy also has to be open for public comment and review prior to adoption. So that kind of codifies a best practice of having that policy in place before you're going to use or deploy your model body-worn cameras. The model policy has actually been, DCJS published it back in 2015. Some folks that are a member of this work group may have been a member of that work group where the body-worn camera model policy was developed. It's a very general model policy covering the use of cameras, when they should be used, when they should be turned off, some equipment guidelines, officer and supervisor responsibilities. It does address some of the privacy concerns, how officers and others should have access to stored footage. And then there's some information about data retention and what data retention policies should be. The policy was developed with input from both state and local law enforcement, as well as other special interest groups and stakeholders. So there was input from the ACLU, NAACP, some other municipal organizations. So it was not just a unilaterally developed policy. There was a lot of input, and it can be found on our website. There's a handy hyperlink if anybody wants the PowerPoint at the end of the presentation. I can go ahead and forward that out. That would lead directly to the policy. Moving on to the 2020 special session appropriation, as Secretary Moran noted, approximately $6.4 million was appropriated for law enforcement agencies, or for grants to law enforcement agencies to support the use of body-worn camera systems. It's important to note that these are one-time grants, so it's not, I don't think it's envisioned as a continuing or everlasting grant program. The eligible recipients, as noted or as written in the budget language, are law enforcement agencies located within the Commonwealth employing law enforcement officers with primary law enforcement duties, including state agencies, local agencies, and then importantly, colleges and universities. So the college or campus police departments are eligible to apply for these grants as well. But this is aimed mainly at, again, at the law enforcement agencies. The qualifying expenditures, again, one-time costs associated with equipment, data storage, maintenance, operation. So if you need to purchase your cameras, if you need to purchase storage space, so your servers or other storage devices, anything to maintain the cameras, or one-time costs associated with operation of the cameras. This does include any sort of accessories for the cameras for agencies that have already purchased them. So if an agency went out and bought cameras with one type of mount, found that those weren't effective and want to get different types of mounts for those cameras, that's going to be an eligible expenditure. So it's anything that's going to help with the operation of those cameras. One big change to from a lot of the grants that we administer is any grant's going to require a 50% match from the locality. So if the locality is asking for $50,000 from the grant fund, they've got to be willing to pony up $50,000 of their own in order to complete the grant process. So while it's certainly going to be helpful, there is going to be a need for the localities to have some skin in the game as well. Our expected timeline for the grant process, we expect a solicitation to go out in December of this year, with a due date probably in either late January or early February. So the grants could be reviewed in February and then awards made in March of 2021. Which is important because in September of 2021, DCJS is going to be required to report to the chairs of House Appropriations and Senate and Finance Appropriations all the distributions that were made, the descriptions of and amounts of equipment purchased, and then any remaining balances in the fund, or from the distributions made to the localities. So everything is going to need to be accounted for. All the equipment purchased or other expenditures are going to be accounted for and reported back to the General Assembly. And that's really it. There's not a whole lot to this in the kind of abstract there. But if anybody has any questions related to those grants, they can certainly contact me. My contact information's up there. Or Tracy Matthews, who is our law enforcement grants supervisor. And his contact information likewise is up there. Tracy's going to be probably the better point of contact because grants are what he does, or one of the major things he does, but I'm helping out with that, so I can also answer any questions or hopefully answer any questions that come up. And
Eric, thank you very much. Yep. No, thank you, Eric. Questions? Comments? We know grants don't pay for personnel. Not a good idea to use grants to hire personnel because of the ongoing costs, but it does represent an opportunity for purchase and equipment and initial storage costs. So any folks, those on the call, do you see this as an opportunity where you avail yourselves of those grants? Excited about it? I can see Dave Johnson, you look excited. Colin, anyone?
Oh, well, I'd be excited, sir, but it's law enforcement, so it doesn't apply to us.
We're all one team, one fight, Dave. Colin? Oh, Shannon?
This is Christian in Louisa County. And certainly the grant is a good opportunity. I'm a little bit disappointed because we had just decided roughly within the last 2 months to purchase an additional round of cameras, and be nice. I'm not sure if I heard that in the presentation, whether or not we could reimburse any costs within a certain amount of time if they've been recently made, or if there might be any consideration of changing the requirements to allow refunding of that. It was literally within the past 60 days.
That's a good question. Keep your receipts. Eric, any comment on that? Can you go back? Any chance to go back?
I think that's something that we'd have to look at. I don't think that was something that was contemplated in the funding, but yeah, so that, I think that's something that would have to be a higher level discussion to see if that would be eligible.
Eric, I'd be glad to hear anything going forward on that, and if you need any details from me, happy to share my contact info with you offline.
Certainly, go ahead and shoot me an email, and I will definitely look into that for you.
Thanks, Eric.
And Brian, to the extent that this might be part of the next steps conversation, is this anticipating that body-worn cameras will not be mandated, and so that these are grants that are just going to try to like kind of help fill this gap? And I'm sorry if I didn't see this in the presentation. And this is kind of to what Christian's point is, which is, are we talking about agencies that haven't started at all, and so we are trying to encourage them to start, or is this even to try to bolster what agencies have started to, but perhaps didn't have the funding to cover everything, or is it both?
Well, I think it's a combination. Dave, do you have any comments with or any others on the line who may have more intel with respect to the $6.4 million that's in the budget?
Secretary Moran, this is Adam Rosatelli with Senate Finance and Appropriations. Yeah, I think that it's all of those things. So I think she's correct. So I think it's to incentivize expansion of use, again, one-time purchases. But yeah, so to incentivize those that haven't otherwise purchased, and then those that have already to kind of support additional equipment and so forth.
And Adam, thanks for that. Shannon also mentioned mandating. I don't think there's been mandate. Do you have any thoughts on that? This appears to be more of a carrot rather than a stick approach, and so it's incentivizing their purchase and use as opposed to mandating.
That's correct. Yeah. Yes.
Mr. Secretary, can I make a comment on the grants? Certainly the localities don't need me sticking up for them, but I think it's only fair to maybe go back to our original work group conversations that eventually the 75-to-1 language for localities funding prosecutors' offices stemmed out of. And really the crux of the work group was the General Assembly was saying, you know, this is a locality decision to get body cameras, and we shouldn't be expected to increase funding for prosecutors because localities have decided to go to body cameras. The localities' response was, you know, we already supplement Commonwealth attorneys' offices, and they're not being funded the way that the General Assembly should be. But with these grants going into place, I think it's a fair argument to say, as we've already been discussing here, that the state is essentially encouraging deployment of body cameras through these grants. And so then the question comes down to, since the state is encouraging the deployment of body cameras throughout Virginia, you know, I could foresee the localities going back to the General Assembly saying, if the state's encouraging body cameras, why are we still responsible for the 75-to-1? I think that just needs to be something that we're all aware of here. Is if the state's going to encourage the deployment of body cameras, then that is probably in the end going to be something that they're going to need to take the responsibility for funding positions in the long run.
Yeah, Secretary Moran, if I could respond, I think Mr. Stolley has a good point there. I think I think that does imply that there's the state's position then would be that we are incentivizing the local deployment of additional body cameras. And I think looking forward again, Robin had mentioned the positions that were that the General Assembly had approved that were subsequently unallotted. And that'll be re-examined. We did provide in the prior session the 20% of unfunded positions, and then again unallotted the 25% of positions. So I think looking at staffing standards, obviously I can't presuppose what the General Assembly is gonna do with respect to Commonwealth's attorney positions, but I would agree with the point that we have kind of conveyed that there is it's kind of an incentivization, I guess, to bring on more body cams.
I really appreciate you weighing in on this, and don't want to put you on the spot, but with Dave Johnson and I had that colloquy about court-appointed attorneys and their fees, private attorneys also having to take the time to review these. Any discussion, in your world around providing additional resources to those stakeholders?
I don't think I can respond to that right now. I mean, that could be examined, right? I can't again presuppose what the members might want to do in that respect, and I think it's going to have to be looked at holistically as we move forward, and then any recommendations that come out of the work group obviously will be considered moving forward as well.
No, fair. Appreciate that. We want to incentivize. Oh, hey, Caitlin, you want to weigh in?
Mr. Secretary, I was just going to add that during the special session, there was a focus on one-time cash because we weren't sure about how our revenues would play out in the future. So I think that's why you're seeing this focus on the one-time equipment grant at this time. So that was the only point I needed to add there.
No, I appreciate that. And we're in the COVID environment with budgets being very uncertain. So I think everybody appreciates that constraint. So, and I think everyone recognizes also we're incentivizing, so that means there will be more body cameras on the street, and that's more pressure on all the various stakeholders. So we're going to have to return to those issues as we go forward, and hopefully in an environment in that additional resources will be available. But I think everybody appreciates that. So the fact that you all will able to come up with that was very significant. Any other kind of free-ranging discussion there? So anything else? Eric, we very much appreciate that on the grants. Anything else? Because there is a public comment next, and then next steps. So maybe we jump to public comment and next steps. We can kind of hash out any other comments or questions folks may have. Dave, are you aware? I mean, I don't think on my screen I have who has signed up for public comment. So do you?
So, Mr. Secretary, there is under the participants button, there's a little hand raise thing. If any member of the public wants to click that, will then be unmuted by the person administering the meeting. If you are on the phone, then you hit *3, and that would also be a signal to the administrator of the meeting to unmute you to speak. So. And I'm not currently seeing anybody having hit the little hand raise button, so. Unless Aaron chimes in to tell me otherwise, it does not look like anyone is to do public comment.
All right. Well then, all right. Well, let's jump. Sounded like we had one of those. Okay. Is that one of the chipmunks? What was that?
I think Mr. Humphrey's trying to speak, but something's wrong with his audio.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't sound like Judge Humphreys, but we'd certainly welcome his remarks. But sounds like the Chipmunks Christmas show. So let's jump to next steps, and hopefully Judge Humphreys can get his audio organized by then. So next steps, folks, and Shannon, Colin, you know, I congratulate you. You're the impetus of this study and Robin's work. So maybe I'll go to you first in terms of what next steps might you would encourage for this group.
Mr. Secretary, I think we just need to continue the work that we're doing. We've all been sidetracked here this year with COVID, and I think the only way that we can get some accurate numbers to not only help prosecutors but public defenders and private attorneys and judges is to continue our work here and to continue to collect the numbers. So that's really what I think we need to do, is just keep on going.
And I would, I join my colleague Colin Stolley in that request, Mr. Secretary. I mean, as we are moving forward in terms of paying not only prosecutors and the public defenders, but also our defense bar, knowing that we, I believe, pay the absolute lowest amount for court-appointed work in the United States. That this work group provides incredibly important data for that bigger discussion about public safety in the Commonwealth. And so to the extent that we've got an amazing group of people, let's just keep on pushing on. And I know that the data will be.
Shannon, you were going a little bit in and out. Oh, yeah, your message about moving forward was heard very well, so loud and clear. Judge Humphreys does have a hand up.
I'm hoping it's working now.
Judge Humphreys, we can hear you loud and clear.
That's good. Sorry about the Alvin and the Chipmunk impression there, but this has been a problem. But we actually have that same issue sometimes with oral arguments. So it's a gremlin that keeps surfacing. Anyway, the only comment I wanted to make, Mr. Secretary, is that we're in the, of course, data collection phase here, and my role is as a representative of the judiciary. And one of the things I suspect that everybody in this meeting, as well as in the General Assembly, would like to know at some point is, since one of the hoped for goals of implementing body camera footage is the more expeditious resolution of criminal cases, among other things, we find a way to track that. And I think that's going to be particularly important now that the General Assembly has made a policy decision to change the way sentencing is done by juries, and in the discussion about that. So the more data I think we can gather on things that will expedite what amounts to the settlement of cases prior to trial, I think is going to be helpful in going forward, because frankly, we spent the bulk of today talking about funding at various levels, and if there's an offset, a measurable offset, I think that's going to be something that the money folks in the staff and the General Assembly would very much like to know about. So we need to gather that data.
I think that's a great point. And I see Christy Wright is on the line. Might that be something that the Office of Executive Secretary might be able to collect, Christy, in terms of that, the court system impact in that cases of either being settled, or might you have some thoughts on that? That's not really a staffing issue.
Right. That is not something that is currently tracked in the systems. That's going to take.
If I could try to rescue Christy there, Secretary, I think probably it's actually the Commonwealth attorneys and the public defenders in the Indigent Defense Commission that probably are best positioned to provide that information, since the court doesn't always know, and in fact usually doesn't know exactly why cases are resolved the way they are, and what might impact on them. So I think that data, that to the extent, and a lot of it's going to be empirical, frankly. I'm not sure how accurate we can pin this down, unless we're going to have every case involve a form to be filled out, involving the impact of body camera footage. But it is something that I think if we can get a handle on it, I think it would be very, very helpful to a lot of folks. But I suspect that the OES, the Office of the Executive Secretary, is not in a position to really put the courts in a position to gather that data, since the judges are rarely involved in the behind-the-scenes plea negotiation. In fact, it'd be improper for us to get too involved in it in any event.
No, I agreed with that, respect to that. And I guess in terms of the volume of cases, but any thoughts? Judge Humphreys mentioned, Indigent Defense Commission, Commonwealth attorneys, private counsel. Dave or others that think that would be something that we could gain some data from?
I think we can. It would be somewhat anecdotal. We're already hearing kind of anecdotally that's the truth, and from both sides. Either a case doesn't go forward the way it was originally charged because of the body-worn camera footage, or it's a situation where it's pled out because there's footage to show the defendant. So that's happening. But I'm not sure how. I mean, I think we know it's happening. Putting an exact number as opposed to just the sense being that I got this offer from the other side because of what was on the body-worn camera, or the same thing. I think the defendant pled, but that's definitely the sense that there's an efficiency here, and just a more. I mean, that's Matt Johnson's on the line from my Hampton office, and I talked to him earlier, and he just said, this is a lot of work, but it's so valuable. No question that it's making a difference in what I would call the quality of justice. But yeah, we can. I don't know that the private bar is going to be in a position to do much other than maybe through VA CBL anecdotally, but we can figure out a way to at least get a sense from our side of the impact. But we know it's there.
And Mr. Secretary, I would just echo some of Dave's comments. I think we do see an impact. I think it's going to be very hard for us to pinpoint what would be body camera footage would be responsible for it. Did they plead guilty because of the body camera footage or from their confession? Which is the one that you're going to attribute the guilty plea to. But I think that may be something where there are cases we can identify that body-worn camera has had an impact in how the case is concluded. And maybe that's just something that we break off into a smaller group. Maybe Dave and I and Shannon can have conversations, and any of the other defense attorneys that are in, to see if there is some way that we can come up with something to try and gauge what those cases are.
Yes, good.
I think going forward, that would be an interesting discussion, Colin. And we're in the age of COVID, which is impacting the criminal justice system, and then we have any number of reforms that have taken place. So it'll be interesting when they're all. I'm not sure I want to be able to assess the causation of certain outcomes in light of all of those factors, but going forward and how we finance. I know this would be important to the legislature and the administration with respect to budgeting and how we respond to the expansion of body camera use. We certainly, I think, assuming that it is resulting in some efficiency in the process, but it'd be nice to be able to attribute some actual data and evidence to that conclusion. So thanks for bringing that up, Judge Humphreys. Any other comments or questions? I think so far we've heard we want to continue this, and it'd be nice to get on the other side of COVID for next spring, so we can kind of reassess where we are, and then also in terms of the new reforms and how we're in the criminal justice system. And I know Ms. Taylor has mentioned on many occasions we underfund criminal justice system. So, you know, with respect at least to Bob, I think we do have a grant now. I think the legislature has recognized their importance to the criminal justice system. There's certainly an interplay with them with respect to the reforms that the legislature has passed. And so I do think it seems to be appropriate for us to reconvene at some time to kind of once again reassess where we are with respect to those issues. And Colin, now that you're the president, you can continue to encourage participation in the survey. I guess I should ask Robin your thoughts with respect to continuing to gather data. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations on how we can help?
Oh, no, no, I think we'll just continue. I mean, obviously, I think we need to continue gathering it. And I think that Colin and I can work together to come up with a solution for that. We've got some thoughts about that at the comp board. And yeah, I mean, I think it's what we need to do so that we don't lose sight of, you know, trying to make progress on seeing if there is a way that we can really quantify this workload. You know, we're looking at some other things on the staffing standard side. And, you know, I think that we just need to be able to provide some good data for this as well.
Good. Well, I think a couple of takeaways now with respect to Mr. Colin and David and others getting together to discuss the efficiency aspect of this, and then Robin and Colin to continue to assess the you know, the staffing standards. So that's great. All right. Well, Dave Cotter, I'm going to hand it over to you to bring us home in terms of what you think the next steps are, and administratively, what do we need to do? I guess my first thing, does the budget language contemplate continuation of this study? And if so, when would you want to get together again?
The budget language currently doesn't contemplate continuation of the study, so that's going to have to be part of the budget going forwards to make that amendment. So currently it is contemplating that the study ends in 2020, but again, it had originally contemplated the study was going to end in 2019, and we had it extended last year. So again, it seems to be the consensus of everybody on this work group that this is an issue that is in need of more study and in need of more time from this group. So that'll be one of the recommendations, is of course putting that, you know, extending the date for our final report of this work group. So with session looming, as in the deadline for requesting pre-file bills is literally on the 30th of November. We are probably not going to be able to accomplish a lot, especially considering all the data needs and holes we have currently, before the 2021 session gets underway. So I think it would be the plan of beginning in the interim. So March, April, May, sometime around there, hit the ground running again, see what the General Assembly did during the 2021 session. By that point in time, we'll also have some idea of how the grant program is going and how that money is going out, because if the grant solicitations are going to be approved in February, money going out the door in March, we'll have some idea how that's working out. So I think that is the general plan to going forward, Mr. Secretary.
Good. Well, I'm supportive of that. The budget language to be submitted and then reconvene and give us some time for hopefully post-COVID world, as well as the grant update and a little bit more data on the reform. So with that, unless anyone else have any comment about next steps, I think that's we've described how we'd like to go forward, and without hearing any objection or any other comment, that's how we'll proceed. Okay. All right. Hearing no further comment, that's how we'll proceed. David, you'll get us the language to make sure we can submit it. And appreciate everybody jumping on. A lot of work. There's still a lot of uncertainties out there because of what we're going through right now. I just want to commend you all, from the Court of Appeals to the legislative branch, to all the Commonwealth's attorneys, defense attorneys working in the court through this pandemic. It's I think Virginia has weathered the storm pretty well, certainly relative to other states, and we're still not out of it. We'll certainly receive good news this week with respect to a vaccine. So it's hopefully a matter of weeks, not months, and we just need to continue to exercise good judgment. And we'll get. I will say, just a shout out to Chesterfield. I did get called for jury duty this week. I showed up, and it was very well run. Clerk's office. They gave us shields and masks and gloves, and everyone well behaved. And the bailiffs, everyone. I did get excused. They didn't. I promised to be fair and balanced, but I was excused. But so at least in Chesterfield, they've restarted their jury trials. I know there's a backup, and I know the next several months are going to be challenging as we continue to move forward. So I just want to say that I don't want to belabor the meeting here any longer, but I do congratulate y'all where everyone seems to be working extremely well. And let's keep it going for the next several weeks. And hopefully when we reconvene, we'll be in a post-pandemic world and getting back to, a normal, some degree of normalcy. So with that, I thank you all very much. I think we're going to adjourn the meeting. And again, appreciate all your work and effort and participation in this meeting and the meetings preceding this one. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.